Welcome everyone. Today we are going to be discussing the question of what changes to the current humanitarian practices are required to ensure that localization of humanitarian action takes place. Now, coming to this question, it is first very important to understand what we actually mean by the term localization. According to the State of the Humanitarian System report, localization means supporting the governments and civil societies of crisis-affected states to play the lead role in humanitarian response, whereas according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, localization in essence is recognizing, respecting, and strengthening the local authorities and the capacity of local civil society. Disaster-affected people are identified as surviving victims, which insinuates that they are actually populations waiting for assistance. When they're seen as victims, outside organizations and governments tend to ignore their capacities to cope, which is very detrimental because their skills are actually valuable resources in rebuilding of the community. As a result, localization can also be seen as community building, which in essence is a two-way dialogue, a dialogue between crisis-affected communities on the one hand and humanitarian organizations on the other. From the communities you get political support, understanding of the conditions of residents, and the contextual knowledge, whereas from humanitarian organizations is where the technical and analytical expertise comes in. Why is the big push for localization happening now, and why is it important? It is important because if the people who are providing help are the same as the local people who are affected, then they're definitely having ethnic and ideological ties and a strong sense of community. Localization is also cost efficient. Cost of hiring international people for help are not only expensive in terms of their salaries but also accommodation costs and travel costs. Local people have contextual knowledge, they have the local skills of what has happened. Localization is also important because of sustainability issues. It is those people who have to live there for the longer term. International humanitarian actors come, help, and go, but it is the people who have to live there, and it is important, therefore, that they make the rules for themselves. Being local is also an attribute for being faster. Local responders are the first responders in any crisis situation, and they can get there faster than any other international humanitarian organization. Also, this is the very same reason due to which they can get access into areas which otherwise international organizations might not get. Now, given all these conditions, it is important to look at the present scenario about where localization stands. In 2017, international NGOs received 94% of all NGO funding, which means national and local NGOs received just 6% of the total funding given to NGOs. Also, of the overall humanitarian funding going to all international and local organizations, only 0.4% went to the local authorities, whereas the rest of it was all shared by international actors. Therefore, given all these conditions, the first World Humanitarian Summit was held in 2016 in Istanbul, in which one major outcome was to increase localization, and as a result, the Grand Bargain has emerged. The Grand Bargain is an agreement between the biggest donors and humanitarian organizations with an aim to work together to increase efficiency, transparency, and harmony with new and existing partners. The Grand Bargain also talks about reinforcing rather than replacing local capacities and national capacities, and it also has an aim to make principled humanitarian action as local as possible and as international as necessary. The Grand Bargain also commits the donors and aid organizations to provide 25% of global humanitarian funding to local and national responders by 2020. Having talked about the Grand Bargain, however, it is important to realize that a mere transfer of items from an international organization to a local responder does not mean localization. It is when the local responder is involved in the entire process of the cycle of the program, from needs assessment to program design and delivery to the final review and evaluation. Also, it is important to note that localization might have come into effect as a known terminology in the recent years. However, it is a known process which has been given a push by various organizations in the past too. For example, in the 1994 Red Cross Code of Conduct, Principle 6 stated that efforts should be made to build the response of humanitarian agencies on local capacities. What are the problems today with localization? As we have seen, the main issue is funding, and within that, it is donor interest and apprehension. Many private firms have focused their attention on the immediate aftermath of high profile disasters in the hope of maximizing the public relations impact of their assistance. This means that most donors only give donations and aid where they think it's going to be beneficial to them. Not only that, the administrative burden to secure funding is very high. Local organizations often have to meet very strict requirements to access institutional funding, including the need to provide years of audited financial statements and strict documentation on everything. This leads to a lot of wastage of time and limits the local and national NGOs' engagement in the international funding sector. There are also restrictive laws and red tapeism. For example, an organization started by Syrian refugees in Turkey is facing difficulty accessing international funding despite possessing relevant knowledge. Red tapeism not only adds to the wastage of time, but it also leads to exhaustion on the part of the local organizations. There are also legal restrictions over anti-terrorism legislation, which pose as hindrances to funding. The problem with reporting demands is that they remain the same, the procedure remains the same, whether it is a multi-million-dollar grant project or a small NGO asking for donation. In light of all this, though, what needs to be kept in mind is that merely pushing for localization is not enough. It needs to be systematic. In the words of MSF, the ambiguity in referring to local actors or local capacities seems to be deliberate. It creates a convenient space for the large variety of stakeholders to interpret the term according to their own interests and agendas. Such negative agendas of local actors need to be carefully addressed and removed. Therefore, what to do? What can we do to increase localization in the current humanitarian practices? Here are some recommendations. To hear and amplify the voices from the global south about their needs, about their funding scenarios, and about the context that the crisis is about. To make cooperatives with international organizations with systematic regulations. To promote complementarity amongst actors, amongst local and international bodies. We also push for recognition of community development as a method of providing humanitarian assistance. Not only that, the need is to follow true partnerships between local and international bodies. At the same time, programs of help should be context specific to each location. Not only that, grants should be flexible to allow for changes in the crisis. The field staff of all the organizations should have a higher decision making authority, which should be decentralized. At the same time, excessive administrative burden and the requirements to produce and provide with lots of documentation should be reduced in order to save time and become more efficient. For organizations that are very much concerned with anti-terrorism legislation, such clauses can be included into the donor agreement. At the same time, all local organizations must be made aware for whenever funding opportunities are available to give them a fair chance of applying for those fundings. And also, this should be done in the local language so that there is no hindrance for their fair chance. Lastly, international organizations must work with local counselors to develop strategies which will be suited to the local context, while at the same time incorporating the views of the affected population and keeping their needs into account. Having said all of that, let's adopt localization, but carefully, systematically, keeping all negative agendas aside and in a way which is beneficial for the local communities.